Right. Are we? Okay, great. I think we're live. Thrilled to have Jackie Hunter here as online as our GIS speaker today. Jackie's had a long career in the pharma industry and also been a real champion of applications of artificial intelligence and biomedicine, going across drug discovery, medical image analysis, microbiome analysis, and so on. So really a pioneer in many ways. Jackie's held senior positions at GSK, and before that at SmithKline Beecham, which merged into GSK, where she brought a number of candidate molecules into drug development. And after leaving GSK, and GSK, she ran the Neurology and GI Center of Excellence for Drug Discovery, and left after leaving GSK, established a consulting company in open innovation, then moved to government. And in the UK government, she was head of the Biotechnology and Biological Sciences Research Council. And then she joined Benevolent AI as the CEO of its drug discovery organization. And then retired from an executive role, but now she remains a board member at Benevolent AI. And she also chairs the board of Brainomics. It's an AI imaging company, bicortex, an AI-enabled microbiome company. And she was the founder, really, of the Stevenage Bioscience Catalyst, which is a science park on the GSK UK campus. She's also director of the UK Bioindustry Association and a member of A-Star's board, and actually travels to Singapore every once in a while. Jackie, very proud to be here. Looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Right, so I shall kick off. My understanding is to talk for 45 minutes and then the rest of the time for questions. So clearly, AI is just becoming ubiquitous in all industries, but really healthcare until relatively recently, and it's really accelerated the adoption of AI. And you can see that if you just look at the publications in Science Direct, where you're just searching for AI in healthcare, you can see over the last sort of 5 years, there's been a tremendous increase in publications of the application of AI for healthcare. I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience about the different types of AI. Obviously, at very sort of basic level, you've got machine learning, which can be supervised, where you can actually you give the machine a training set of data where the outcomes are known. And once it's been trained, you can give it new inputs and ask it to classify the outputs, or semi-supervised or unsupervised, where you don't tell it what the outcomes are, but it has to predict and look for patterns in the data. More complicated and sophisticated applications using neural networks and in various forms form the basis for much deeper learning models. And natural language processing has obviously come on leaps and bounds, especially with the recent publications from Google and Microsoft of their engines for NLP. Robotics, the applications of robotics ranging from surgery all the way through to home-assisted living are beginning to impact on healthcare. And visual analytics in terms of pathology, radiology, etc., are beginning to really they were one of the first major applications in healthcare that could show the power of this technology. And in terms of the financials, the global AI and healthcare market is set to be an exponential growth. Obviously, we've got the availability of big data. COVID, as I mentioned earlier, has driven a lot of the adoption, and the need to create new solutions using this technology. But also with aging populations in the developed and developing world, there's a real need to reduce healthcare costs, and AI offers a real opportunity for that. In the Topple, Eric Topple was asked by Jeremy Hunt, who was then Health Secretary in the UK government, to review how AI could make an impact on the UK healthcare system, and what should be done to better train the workforce for it. And you can see the kind of, they did a survey, surveys have been done of the adoption of various types of AI across the UK NHS. And here he's really a prediction about the projected impact of the top 10 digital healthcare technologies from 2020 to 2040. It's notoriously difficult to predict how things are going to go. So, for example, in terms of genomics, the cost of whole genome sequencing is falling all the time, and eventually in the near term, it will be cheaper and better to just read the whole genome of an individual rather than taking more selective approaches. So some of the things I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about automated image interpretation. I'm going to talk about AI and drug discovery, which is using some of these technologies like NLP and predictive analytics, and finally talk a bit about the microbiome. So I included here the genomic specific recommendations from the Topple review because I thought they might be timely in terms of thinking about the Institute. But some of them are obvious, like providing clear frameworks for use of genetic data, anonymization of patient data, etc. But really the need for certainly clinicians and healthcare practitioners to really have a good understanding of genomic data and its implications, and to have a lifelong training in the area with accredited career pathways for clinicians, and this comes back, I think, if you're talking about a healthcare situation, actually having the time and the recognition to implement some of these technologies, because it does take time when you're replacing, for example, a way of doing things within the healthcare pathway versus just slotting in a way of automating an existing process. And finally, data governance, especially with regard to relatives who, for example, whilst you might be very happy for your data to be used for research purposes or other purposes, relatives might not, especially where it informs their predisposition to disease that they weren't aware of. And this is just one example from 2018, where machine learning was applied to brain cancer pathology. And essentially, the images were analyzed by pathologists for from brain tumors. And you can see here that what was interesting is that in most cases, there was an identical diagnosis, but in a subset of those, the computer was more specific in terms of the subclassification. And where there was a discrepancy between the diagnosis, actually, the computer was right over 90% of the time. Where the computer didn't assign a diagnosis, it was likely that the tumor, that the computer had not been exposed to the requisite number of rare tumor classes. So this is a very straightforward application of AI. And it goes across the whole spectrum of healthcare, from early diagnosis and triage right the way through to treatment and monitoring. And this was a report that Let Consulting did, which shows that there are a number of companies based in Singapore who actually are involved in this healthcare space. So first of all, I just want to talk to you about, I used to work in stroke, and really understanding and improving stroke diagnosis is absolutely critical in terms of being able to timely either get the patient to be thrombolyzed to bust the clot, or for thrombectomy to be able to surgically remove the occlusion. And Brainomics is a company based in Oxford who have a suite of analytics that work on both MRI and CT scans. The suite called eStroke comprises eAspects, which assesses a clinical score, which allows the neurologist to detect the stroke and the volume of the and location of the stroke. ECTA, which looks at large vessel occlusion and standardizes the assessment of collateral flow, and then from that to automatically compute what area of the stroke is the core area that is already dead, and what area is the in the penumbra, which allows which is potentially salvageable with treatment. What's brilliant about this is within minutes it has computed and measured the volumes of the occlusion. So even before the patient's really out of the scanner, the neurologist will receive the information, and this can come comes either through email or a mobile app, so they get the absolute scans and they get the interpretation of the scans. And so with the ECTA, they can look to see whether there's a large vessel occlusion on CT angiography where you're measuring blood flow, and so you can validate a CTA, a CS collateral store. So it's a very powerful way of applying the technology, and it's demonstrated benefit. In fact, there was one case study where a woman was a young lady presented, and the clinician failed to identify the stroke. eStroke identified the stroke, and she was able to have thrombolysis, which essentially saved her life. And even if, irrespective of whether you're a junior stroke physician or a consultant or a radiologist, this graph on the left shows the accuracy of diagnosis is considerably increased with the use of eAspects. So it's really augmented intelligence, if you like. And this is some data from 2018, and 2017 in a hospital where looking at the number of patients that received thrombolysis was significantly increased with the use of eStroke. And overall, it's increased treatment rates by about 80% in those hospitals where it's used. And of course, that has a big impact on both quality of life for the patient and the cost of care. So the next area I want to talk about really is AI and drug discovery. I used to have the side that said AI will impact, but I can say now that all of these areas are, to a greater or lesser degree, being impacted by artificial intelligence. I'm going to talk more specifically about an example from Benevolent where coming up with identifying novel targets, but also, and I know this is work that's ongoing at GIS in terms of being able to analyze complex multiplex assay systems or genomics, which allow better target disease associations. In terms of chemical space, we've obviously had the publications of AlphaFold 2, and it's clear that a lot of targets that were previously undruggable, proteins previously undruggable, are now druggable, as well as being able to do small molecule drug design that targets, for example, RNA. So a number of companies, including Benevolent, have shown that you can speed up the time from identifying a target to actually having a candidate molecule significantly. And novel synthetic routes allow the development of molecules that hitherto have not been possible to make. And the idea there is you make fewer molecules and you get to your endpoint more rapidly. I think it's taking a little longer in terms of the impact on drug development, especially in preclinical development, where I think there's still a big need to pull data and really look at ways of reducing toxicity and hence animal use in terms of being able to progress compounds. But better patient selection and stratification, and this is where the microbiome company example will come in terms of the fact that we know that for many drugs on the market, 40 to 50% of people don't respond to them, and it's finding out which ways we can how we can do that. I know in Singapore that there's work ongoing in terms of individualizing combinations of cancer treatment, and that does can mean decreasing as well as increasing doses. And one statistic that's quite shocking really is that about 30% of phase 3 trials fail to recruit all the number of patients that they need. And a lot of this is due to the fact that you're out there with a very heterogeneous patient population in many cases, and you want to make it easy for the patients to stay in the trial. So if you can enhance compliance and retention, then that's going to have a big effect on the efficiency of trials. And we know that AI in pharma is now becoming more and more significant in terms of it's both in-house and through collaboration. So a recent review last year, actually in Nature Reviews Drug Discovery, showed the increase in, they analysed the information from, I think, 30 companies that were in the AI drug discovery space and looked at their portfolios and compared them to the top 20 big pharma. And actually, in terms of richness of portfolio, the AI-enabled companies were significantly more successful in producing preclinical assets and, to some extent, clinical assets than the large pharma. So these are slides from Benevolent AI. It's a company that's based in London and essentially has a platform which whereby a knowledge graph underpins the drug discovery target identification, and through that you're able to explore diseases more effectively, use various models to target particular to do your target predictions, and then you can there's a tool called Whale which allows you to really easily assess the tractability of your target on a number of parameters. Again, I guess most of you are familiar with knowledge graphs, but if you're not, it's a really powerful way of being able to bring information together. So entities such as, in this case, places, cities, museums, etc. Or if you're a Netflix person, you've got films, genre, etc. Essentially, it allows rapid surfacing of relevant information, but it also allows you to make inferences about relationships. So in a biomedical knowledge graph, you've obviously got a different set of entities. You've got genes, proteins, diseases, pathways, mechanisms, drugs, etc. And you the way the knowledge graph works is it automatically ingests through both a structured and an unstructured pipeline information from the literature, from papers, from experimental data, from libraries, etc., omics data sets, and then builds the knowledge graph, and the magic happens in terms of being able to generate relational inferences. So you have a number of relationships that are known to exist, but through those you can predict relationships that should exist but are not yet known. And that forms the basis of the kind of proprietary information that Benevolent has in terms of developing its own drug discovery platform. In the collaboration Benevolent has with AZ, they created a AZ-specific version of the graph, because all of the provenance of all the entities, the data is known, can exclude data sets that AZ would not have access to and include data sets from AZ to create a graph that is very AZ specific. So that's really the data foundation. And then there's a suite of tools for the scientists which allow them to interrogate the graph, look for novel targets, and then evaluate them and do the assessment. So an example here would be, if we look at, can we treat ALS by reversing the question would be, can we treat ALS by reversing autophagy impairment in microglia by reducing oxidative stress? So you can ask questions of the graph that can be very specific or more general, as in an example where I'll come on to for treatment for COVID. So it allows us to surface mechanisms and relationships that otherwise you would not have been able to find. And you can enrich the graph with particular data sets for particular diseases. There are multiple models that are used to expand the pool of possible targets. Large language models, graph models, genetic and genomic models, and transcriptomic models. So we don't just use one particular way of interrogating the graph to come up with a set of novel targets, but we will choose the model depending on the data set, and also compare across models. Over the last few years, we've been able to enrich the graph with patient data, especially multiomics data, so that we can identify latents that might predict particular endotypes for particular targets. And this hopefully will allow us to be more specific in terms of, certainly in the phase 2 patient population, that we will be able to select our patients for, or even use it in terms of drug repurposing. And in terms of further triage down the line, I mentioned WHERE, which is a way of being able to select whether or not this target is novel, whether this target is chemically tractable, patentable, and how safe it is. Are the toxicities that are related to this target that might be negative in the particular disease that we're looking for. So it really allows a very neat prioritization of the targets. And so this is the platform that Pipeline Benevolent currently has. It's I think one of the things that you'll see for a biotech is that it's very diverse in its disease area, and that's really because the platform is pretty disease agnostic, and it allows you to be able to have a degree of expertise in the disease through access to information that you probably wouldn't be able to do if you weren't using this approach. I'm particularly pleased about the progress in glioblastoma because that's a very devastating disease, and there's a collaboration with Singapore in that particular disease area. So just to give you an example, well, two examples actually. The first is around baricitinib. Paracetamin was a JAK inhibitor that Lilly had developed, but very early on, in about March 2020, one of our scientists used the knowledge graph to say, when the role of inflammation was identified in COVID, have we got JAK inhibitors that are antiviral at a dose or an exposure that would allow them to be used in COVID? And baricitinib, there were several JAK inhibitors identified that had an antiviral mechanism, but baricitinib was the only one that had it in the same exposure range as would be anti-inflammatory in people. And we clearly weren't going to develop anything in COVID. So we approached Lilly, we gave them the information, and they did their own experiments. We did some of our experiments. There were investigator-led studies. And ultimately, this led to it being approved for the use in COVID patients, reducing mortality and in hospitalized patients and in those who are being ventilated. And in fact, just recently, there's been a comparison between dexamethasone and baricitinib in terms of their efficacy in COVID-19, and they are equivalent, with baricitinib probably having lower side effects. So that's one example of how really rapidly you can come up with a hypothesis that can be tested and have a significant impact. More recently, Benevolent's been working on ulcerative colitis. It's a chronic disease. There is a great portion of patients who are refractory, so that in terms of moderate to severe patients, 20 to 40% of them don't respond to the standard of treatment, anti-TNF. And obviously, a lot of treatments do have side effects. First line is probably steroids, and they have significant effects on long-term treatments, such as osteoporosis. But there are also black box warnings for other therapies. So there's a big unmet need for an oral small molecule that is safe and effective, especially in refractory patients. And Benz 8744 is the candidate molecule that is being developed by Benevolent. It's an oral peripherally restricted PDE10 inhibitor. And the sort of target identification workflow for this disease is obviously, can we, you ask the biological question, can we actually reduce ulcerative colitis by targeting pathways in epithelial cells and tissue resident immune cells? And PDE10 came out as a very strong candidate with absolutely no previous linkage to UC. It's been quite extensively investigated in neurological disease. So we were able to experimentally validate that hypothesis in our laboratories and through collaboration. So this was a collaboration with Bart's, where biopsies were taken from ulcerative colitis patients. If you culture them, they have a very significant basal cytokine release, so they're really retaining the disease phenotype. And looking at the readouts were IL-6 and IL-8, which were key mediators of UC pathology. And if we look at treating the samples with, this was an earlier molecule which was used in target validation, so tool compound Ben 3218 versus the positive controls, prednisolone and JAK inhibitor. You can see that in terms of both IL-6 and IL-8 release, there's a significant reduction compared to the DMSO control. So we felt very confident that this target was validated for ulcerative colitis. And we're able to rapidly design compounds which led to a candidate being nominated in 2021. So that was 2 years from program initiated. And we're working now at Benevolent on developing, characterizing patient data so that we can, using the molecular descriptors that we believe are relevant to inform our trial design. And we do believe that there is a clear rationale that PDE10 has inhibition has the potential to normalize the dysregulated mechanisms in ulcerative colitis, which is one of the forms of inflammatory bowel disease. There's a lot of transcriptomics data that supports this rationale. It regulates signal to transduction by hydrolyzing CGMP, and it's significantly upregulated in UC-derived colon and colonic mucosal samples. Reduced levels of CGMP correlate with increased levels of TNF-alpha. So there's a lot of evidence that CGMP is downregulated in UC. And so that by inhibiting PDE10 and increasing CGMP and cyclic AMP, you can both reduce intestinal inflammation via NF-kappa B and tissue resident macrophage activation, but also improve tight junction assembly via protein kinase G and protein kinase A mediated decreases in phosphorylated myosin light chain. And also via PKG phosphorylation of the cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulator, which in turn improves barrier integrity. So there's two avenues, and it makes great sense. And so I think there's a lot of potential here. So it's a really nice example of identifying a novel target and then going back and being able to validate it and see what it and validate it and see how the target could have an effect in the disease. So lastly, I just want to finish with another company called bicortex. When I was at Glaxo and ran the neurology and GI set in 2006, we were very interested in the microbiome and its role in not just actually in GI disease, but also in terms of neurology, because there was emerging information about its role in modulating, for example, vagal function. We were ahead of our time because the sequencing technology and a lot of the basic information and, of course, the way of mapping these interactions was just not available. But over the last 10, 15 years, there has really been a significant increase, both in the ability to study and map bacteria, but also in the evidence that the microbiome has a real role to play in terms of drug efficacy, and not just through drug metabolism, but the bicortex have developed a knowledge graph around the microbiome, but also predictive engines, which have really identified interactions between a lot of compounds and their and bacteria in the gut. So the carbon mirror is really the basis, the platform that bicortex uses. And one thinks very much that drug bacteria metabolism can affect oral drugs, obviously through the gut, but also the indirect microbiome interactions with physiology, like the immune system, like, for example, the vagus nerve, will not only affect oral drugs, but also intravenous drugs. And there's more and more evidence now that there are local effects via specific tissues. I mean, we know that the nose has a microbiome, the skin has a microbiome, but also, for example, the tumors have a microbiome. So in terms of that particular aspect, the tumor microbiome is now becoming more well characterized in particular types of tumors. They're found, the bacteria found peripherally and deeply within the tumor. And to date, over 33 major cancer types have demonstrated that there is a microbiome within the tumor, and they persist in metastasis, as well as being shown to shape epitope presentation on the cancer cells. So we can use, bicortex can use its engines to be able to predict potential interactions between those tumors, tumor microbiome, and anti-cancer drugs. And that's one of the areas that they're pursuing very actively. They have the world's largest microbiome knowledge graph, built both from publicly available data. They have microbiome samples, and they can predict drug bacteria interactions for novel compounds. And they're working both in terms of consumer health applications, but also in terms of progressing new and existing therapies in indications. As well as that, the CTO is from Rolls-Royce, and the way they're approaching the simulation engines is slightly different. That's with Benevolent. So it's a different approach in terms of being able to both design and predict the properties of molecules, and hence also simulate what the clinical studies at scale and time and cost in a way that is you wouldn't be able to do it in any other way. So I hope those examples have shown you how the power of AI can be applied in a number of different areas. There are clearly challenges going ahead in terms of the ethical issues, maintaining patient data confidentiality. There's a lot of discussion about trusted research environments and bringing the algorithms to the data, but then how you standardize that is going to be very important. Transparency of algorithms and the application of data standards is something that is still a work in progress, I think, in many cases, as well as having the right diversity of data. This recent analyses of clinical trials, GSK did one that showed that the clinical trials were not, the patient populations were not representative of the patient populations in the actual diseases themselves in North American clinical trials. I'll finish in a moment on the next slide about the cultural and organizational barriers to implementation. It's important as I mentioned right at the beginning, that you have people who are not necessarily all data scientists, but are aware of the issues around implementation and the knowledge, so that you're not just necessarily automating processes that exist, but actually being able to do things in completely different ways. Standards are important in terms of things like and regulation. If your software is continually learning, at what point do you stop and CE mark or get FDA approval for your device or your algorithms? And if you're applying your product across, or your application across a range of different healthcare systems, all have different cloud standards, etc., for data storage. Trying to do that in a scalable way is going to be important. And then business models. How do you value data? How do you value being able to predict better targets? So there's a lot of, it's a very dynamic situation. And certainly within the UK, Health Education England, working with the NHS, has put out a number of reports about how to build a framework to increase confidence in AI among the healthcare workforce, because in clinical use, clearly there is a lot of validation that needs to be done, but very basic things like workflow integration and the clinical context is really important. And one of the reasons why the Brainomics solution has been so widely embraced is because it took a lot of time to develop it, but it was developed with clinicians in the way the workflow worked for the clinician and the radiologist. And I think that's something that you shouldn't underestimate. And then in terms of the implementation, strategy and the culture is really important. Leadership here in terms of ensuring that you fully evaluate the system's impact and that the implementation is supported. And I mentioned earlier the regulations, standards and guidelines, etc. So at Whistle Stop Tour, I'd just like to say thanks to Benevolent, Brainomics and bicortex for letting me talk about their work, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Jackie. Enlightening tour of all the different applications of AI. And at first impression, I'd say it's just such a massive amount of work gone into creating these AI resources. Lots of questions. There's some questions in the chat and so many angles we can go at. I wanted to start by picking up on one thing you said, targeting mRNAs. Can we say that's a low-hanging fruit because there are lots of known undruggable proteins right now? And if you could somehow, use AI to design, say, small molecules to target the corresponding mRNAs, is that really the first place to go?
I mean, I do think that's a real opportunity. And obviously, you can do very effective target validation as well if you could, for knocking out your RNA. So I think there is an opportunity. There are a number of companies like Cerner that are springing up to take advantage of that. And I think with the computational tools we've got now, there's a real possibility that you'll be able to do it.
I see. So you're saying that they're working on small molecule RNA interactions using AI?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Another quick question, and I'll go to the ones in the Q&A. What is, to be competitive in AI and drug discovery, what are the key competitive capabilities one needs as a technology developer rather than a user of the AI? Again, this comes from it seems so almost dauntingly complex, the number of ways in which you need AI, the number of steps you have in the drug discovery pipeline. So say Singapore wants to develop AI-driven drugs, right? Or discover AI-driven drugs. What capabilities does Singapore need?
I think one of the most important things is to make sure that your data scientists and the people, your biologists and chemists are working very closely together. That so that you're asking the right questions and you're focused, and then not try to do everything. There are some things where it's there are things you can get off the shelf, like ChatGPT and things like that, which you could employ rather than trying to do your own bespoke systems. I think there's also looking at the data sets that you have in Singapore, or access or relevance to, will be important to allow you to focus on those areas where you can get the most information most quickly. And you have quite a lot of powerful computation and a lot of genetics and genomic analysis in Singapore. So, I think that's a good place to start.
Fantastic. Thanks. I will, let me go to the questions in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee. I want to ask you about the knowledge graph platform of Benevolent AI. Can a company get or purchase access to that platform and just use it? Or, is it so complicated that we also need a Benevolent AI scientist to help the company use?
No, actually, it's very intuitive, and one of the ways, I know that Benevolent would like more people to be able to use it. There are a number of issues one has to look at. So, for example, Benevolent pays to access data for certain publications, journals, etc. And therefore you can't really make some of it. You would have to work out what data you could make. No, if you created a knowledge graph that was only using publicly available data, then that's something you might be able to allow more people to use. At the moment, it's not available for people to use, but who knows in the future.
I see. So just to clarify, the Benevolent AI knowledge graph is proprietary and for internal use only. It's not,
Yeah. So for example, in the AstraZeneca example I talked about, when we created the knowledge graph for AstraZeneca, mirrored the knowledge graph for AstraZeneca, we had to take out of it certain sources that we had paid to access, but AstraZeneca haven't paid to access. So we have licensing agreements, and then there's obviously some proprietary data that we've generated from our experimental studies that's in there as well. So
I see. So then the more easy and common mode of engagement, I guess, would be for the company to come to you and say, you want to develop a drug in this space, and then, can you use your knowledge graph to suggest some candidates and help us to choose them?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Got it. Okay. This is a very broad question. What is needed to go towards completely predictive and preventive healthcare ecosystem? I presume predicting disease incidence.
Yes, I think, again, that is definitely some way off because of the levels of uncertainty in biology. It's much easier to do the predictions when you're building an engine for Rolls-Royce and you can make prototypes and stuff like that and iterate very fast. But I think if I think about the technologies we have, one of the biggest impacts is, can we predict what drug is going to work in what patient more effectively than we do now? Because that will reduce unnecessary exposure to drugs for patients. It will get them more rapidly to, hopefully, to the drug that will work for them. And therefore, it will also cut healthcare costs. I think areas like informing people about wellness, which is really where the healthcare system needs to go to, is more of a, not so much a treating illness, but promoting wellness. There's a lot of factors there that are actually more social science than they are data science. And that will require more cognitive methods, perhaps, to, I mean, you know, people know they shouldn't smoke and they still smoke, you know, I mean, stuff like that. But people know they shouldn't eat too much, but they still eat too much. But in terms of making a healthcare system more efficient and effective, I think there are a lot of the technology exists now. It's just not applied consistently in best practice. And that's one of the things. We've got a workshop in the UK for the Academy of Medical Sciences to try and look at that in March, because there are pockets where, you know, AI to triage for sepsis, or for managing diabetes patients, or virtual skin, virtual clinics for orthopedics and things like that. But they're isolated and they're not disseminated and applied consistently. So I think having some way of integrating best practice and applying it uniformly, and allowing, I mean, I'm a great believer in standards, and actually, you know, standards will allow companies to come in and test their products, or ways in which you can standardize your patient selection, whatever is important. So I think Singapore has an opportunity, because it's a relatively small country and is well integrated, to perhaps look at it as a test bed for that kind of systemic approach.
Absolutely. Wellness is a very different approach. Another question is about the success, the remarkable successes you had with the Benevolent AI platform. And the question is, what is the hit rate? Meaning, how many non-successful predictions did you have for those successful predictions?
Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you. Obviously, there are some, you triage and you go for the things that make sense and that are tractable, etc. So there are things that don't work. But certainly from the AstraZeneca collaboration, they've taken a number of targets into the portfolio. So I just don't have a figure in my head about what the hit rate is. But I think if you think, for me, it's not just the hit rate, which is important, but it's how much time you take to get there and the effort to get there. And you can generate hypotheses in a very time and cost effective manner and rank them such that if you think about what normally happens in the drug discovery program, is one or two scientists might come up with a hypothesis through reading the literature, and then they'll probably do a bit more experimentation, and it's very singular. So you're not like ranking a whole load of hypotheses at the same time. And I think one of the benefits is you can ask a lot of questions, and then you can see what you can pick the best answers, if that makes sense. And then you're triaging and ranking against each other. And so you're not setting in train a whole load of work on one thing for probably about a year. You're actually comparing maybe 10 things in a few months.
Makes sense. Absolutely. A question from Jay Shin. The knowledge graph heavily relies on integration of large, complex, unstructured data from many different sources. How to ensure that the data do not reveal, are accurate, and can inaccuracies actually, hurt the quality of the results, and so what's a true versus false positive rate from the outcome of the knowledge graph?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question you get asked a lot, and it's about the signal and the noise, really. Clearly, not every paper that you ingest actually has data that's reproducible, but it's the sheer volume of data should reduce the impact of any particular data point being inaccurate. And indeed, actually, some of the existing structured data we found has some inaccuracies in it from our exploration of the graph. So yes, it's not perfect, but I think the volume of the data will reduce the impact of any one or two imperfect points.
As long as it's correct on average, or something like that.
Yeah.
From Kiran, who I think is an AI person looking to get into drug discovery. So is it a serious disadvantage for an AI person to not have a deep background in disease biology? Can that person still get in? How did that person get in?
Oh, absolutely. It's definitely not a disadvantage. And in fact, in some ways, one of the things that I like about the approach from sort of Benevolent is if you are a deep disease biology person, you will have a lot of biases about what you believe is right, and actually having a very agnostic and sort of challenging kind of mindset is what's required. The important thing is to bring the ability to interrogate the knowledge rather than actually bringing a knowledge set that you've already constrained yourself with. So I would definitely say you've absolutely got a future in drug discovery.
You've just warmed the hearts of all the data analytics people in the audience. Thank you for that. What are the Mayank Thakur? What is the skill and knowledge gap? What are the skills and knowledge we need learn before joining a company? And this person is pursuing his master's in genomics right now. I presume he means a AI in healthcare or something company.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will depend to some extent on what type of company you are joining. I think the important thing is to be open to and adaptable to applying your knowledge and gaining new knowledge to the business situation that you will be in. Clearly, there is a big need for data scientists. There's a big need for people who are able to interrogate genomic data, especially at patient level, but also in things like RNA-seq assays, CRISPR-Cas knockout kind of cell assays. So complex multiomics assays are being used more and more in terms of both interrogating the effects of targets, for example, on oncology cell development or patient endotyping. So I think the important thing is to go and talk to people and see what skills particular companies or organizations need at that time. Some companies may be very well equipped in terms of algorithm development for or machine learning or NLP for interrogating literature, but don't have a lot of skills around genomics. It just depends.
valuable career advice. Thank you so much, Jackie. We've reached the end of the hour. It's been a real privilege hearing you speak and address our questions, and hope to see you in Singapore.
Yeah, it'd be great to meet up. I'm coming over in April and again later in the summer, so it'd be nice to meet up.
Wonderful. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you for listening. Thank you.